The Millennia stories of Brian Aldiss. An Hegelian perspective, spirit emptied out into time. The ultimate millennia, or visiting amoeba, as the story was originally called. An itinerant peddler strays beyond the galaxy and has to land on a nearby planet to replenish his ship's oxygen supply. The ship's instruments say that the world is safe, but the air kills him just as a man-like creature emerges from a lake. So, divided up into two sections, which will prove very important. A man comes across a strange planet between galaxies where space should be empty and meets his demise upon meeting a new man, who then goes on a mission to alert the humans of an impending event. After absorbing all knowledge from the peddler's ship at library, the creature flies the ship back into the galaxy, raises an invasion fleet, heads for Earth. Opposing forces are rallied to unite against the common enemy, which is just a ruse to get both sides united in a common front to resolve this event. In the fabulous city of Naon, the new creature tells the supreme suzerain that matter has grown tired and exhausted. It is beginning to collapse back into the nothingness whence it came, making room for a new creation. This is Hegel's phenomenology of spirit. It is not difficult to see that ours is a birth time in a period of transition to a new era. Spirit has broken with the world it has hitherto inhabited and imagined, and is of a mind to submerge it in the past, and in the labour of its own transformation. Spirit is indeed never at rest, but always engaged in moving forward, but just as the first breath drawn by a child after its long, quiet nourishment breaks the gradualness of merely quantitative growth, there is a qualitative leap, and the child is born, so likewise the spirit in its formation matures slowly and quietly into its new shape, dissolving bit by bit the structure of its previous world, whose tottering state is only hinted at by isolated symptoms, the frivolity and boredom which unsettle the established order, the vague foreboding of something unknown. These are the heralds of approaching change, the gradual crumbling that left unaltered the face of the whole is cut short by a sunburst which in one flash illuminates the features of the new world. Spirit is always moving on. Spirit is always progressing. In any given setting, it may be stagnant spirit that has already reached the pinnacle of its development, and it is not going to go any further, and will indeed begin to decline, rigidify, ossify, and this is represented by the peddler in the story, while we adapt or continue to change and react to the new times, not simply in a reactive way, but in a proactive way also, a thinking way, a way of trying to make sense out of the new factors having to be dealt with. Ours is a birth time in a period of transition to a new era. A birth time, that is to say, something new is entering the stage that is not merely a period of transition, for transitions are occurring all the time, obviously. Rather, this is a dividing point. Something new is occurring. What precisely that is, Hegel will not inform us until later on into the phenomenology, and we will get to that. Visiting amoeba gives a vivid description of such a transition. This is when the first part of the tale moves into the second part, and completely new world opens up. Again, the hellish blue pattern scissored across the flagship's course. Prim had no time to swerve away. They rocketed towards the dazzling pattern. At the last moment, bombardment fired a superfuser dead ahead. Superfuser and trellis met. The two insensate energies clawed each other. Like vast beasts of prey, instead of spreading its usual explosion, the fusion climbed the writhing squares of trellis, gobbling as it mounted. At the centre it left a widening circle of nothingness. We're going back to nothingness, you see, through which the flagship shot unharmed. It climbed to the trellis corners. Barbed fire, devouring fire, it reached the four giant vessels. Just for a moment they remained intact, each radiating a three-dimensional rainbow, which flickered magically up and down the spectrum and was visible hundreds of light years away. Then that blinding beauty fused, and the four rainbow orbs merged and became a sunlight. They sucked, gutted, and went out, and a great gap in the nothingness of the universe appeared and spread. The ineluctable fabric of space itself was being devoured. Several Yenisvar, that's Earth by the way, Yenisvar ships were engulfed in this cataclysm. The flagship was spared no time to rejoice. The moment of its great triumph was also the moment of its destruction. A translucent globe from an enemy destroyer caught its dorsal vein. Like an electronic monster, the globe spread tentacles of light and engulfed the flagship. An Hegelian metaphor captures the basic idea of what is transpiring here. Between the qualitative and the quantitative, that ultimately culminates in a new world bursting out like a sunburst. A dramatic change has happened. That was just described so vividly by Aldiss. Everything becoming illuminated. Remember the light. And now looking different in a sunburst. Such indeed may dazzle us and present us with more than we can take in. The birth time, when spirit is indeed never at rest, is always engaged in moving forward, when spirit has broken with the world that it has hitherto inhabited and imagined. The world that spirit has inhabited is in part the product of its own processes and of thought, its processes of thought, and of its own imagination. And spirit's imagination will now also be set free. The metaphor for quantitative growth is of an embryo, though in visiting amoeba the metaphor is of, an embryo of an amoeba, visiting amoeba. In the womb and its development from minute cells to complete life forms is a human being, and all human beings began as tiny anuses. In the first few weeks after fertilization, they are nothing more than a small group of cells called a blastula, and this blastula bursts open from the inside out, making a little opening called a blastospore. And it is the first of the human being's proto-organs to begin forming. The blastopore is just a minuscule anus, and the rest of the human being's body develops from there. So there was a time when we were all ourselves. The other organs become developed, and it is prepared to become free and independent of the matrix within which it has grown and developed, including not only the mother, who has been bearing it for 9 months, but also the organs that go along with it, such as the placenta, such supports that may now be dispensed with. Recall Wittgenstein's ladder that we can throw away once we've climbed up it. The quote from the Tractatus: "My propositions serve as elucidations in the following way. Anyone who understands me eventually recognizes them as nonsensical when he has used them. As steps to climb beyond them, he must, so to speak, throw away the ladder after he has climbed up it. He must transcend these propositions, and then he will see the world aright." And this is one time when Wittgenstein does speak truth. His propositions are nonsensical. This is quantitative growth. If all we see is the quantitative growth, it could not be foreseen that there would be a qualitative leap, but there is. A qualitative leap, we're making one from the first section of the story to the second, is a qualitative leap. And Aldiss captures this quite vividly by the way there's a transition in the way that it is written. A qualitative leap in all sorts of processes whereby the quantitative can increase as much as it wishes, but once it reaches a certain point, something new occurs, and a new world opens up, a new condition that will be birth for the child. The point of the quantitative growth that it is undergoing is not merely to keep on growing and growing and growing, but for something radically new, something higher, something with greater possibilities. Consciousness, full consciousness. An amoeba can show complex behaviors like memory, decision-making, anticipation of change, but is not self-aware, as far as I know. It has not full consciousness. Full consciousness of being, an independent being, outside of the womb, albeit babies are not totally independent, as the Greek philosopher Anaximander said a long time ago. He argued for an evolutionary view of living things because the first creatures originated from the moist element by evaporation, and humans originated from some other kind of animal. Well, amoebas originally, I suppose. Such as fish. Anaximander thought we evolved from fish, which is not completely wrong as far as I know. Since man, they were in need of a long period of nurture and could not have survived if they'd always been what they are now. There is a fundamental difference between a baby before his or her birth and a baby after his or her birth. And part of that is the matter of the world, the nature of the world rather, that it's experiencing. And part of that is in the liberation of its potentials, which will take a long time to develop. Now, world historical events were occurring in Hegel's day, and so too there are in our own era. There were the Napoleonic Wars, not really dynastic struggles between European monarchs, albeit Napoleon is an emperor, but an emperor of the French who have been through decades of revolution, and that has seen the beheading of royalty, the banishing of the church, and so on, all to be replaced by a regime set upon making everything entirely rational, even to the point of imposing the decimal system upon the days and the months. But that really worked out well. A regime that developed new ways of doing things, of articulating politics, of changing the order of military affairs, of giving people a different consciousness. European states could no longer feel secure about the other cultures they inhabited after the French Revolution. Traumatic upheavals we can endeavour to make sense of, to inquire into the meaning of this new world they have been thrown into. But in Aldiss's tale of visiting amoeba, this recounts a much more profound and far-reaching qualitative leap. It's not merely an historical development. It's the sort of thing that Hegel has in mind here. A note that the second part of the tale, the narrative shifts into the second person to signal this qualitative leap. The highest stared at you, expecting a reply. As if uncertain for the first time, you looked searchingly at one eye and the others. They stared blankly ahead, too absorbed with the prospect of a catastrophe to notice you. Your scientists are to be congratulated, you said. They are late with their discovery of instability, but at least they have found it out for themselves. It is a catastrophe, my friends, here, and I did not begin. It began long ago, and it was about that I came to Yinisfar to tell them, and you. For the first time the highest showed emotion. He rose from the couch, clutching its back fiercely. You impertinent barbarian, you came here to rape and loot and pillage. What do you know of these matters? I came here to announce the end of things, you told him. How I arrived, whether as captive or victor, was no concern of mine, so long as the people of every world had been roused to know of my coming. That was why I staged this invasion. Such a thing is easily done, provided you can read and provoke the few basic human passions. If I had come here alone, would you have known Arcade? Who would have known Arcade? As it is, the whole galaxy has its myriad eyes open, and I focused them on Yinisfar. They may die knowing the truth. Back to the phenomenology. But the other side of its becoming, history, is a conscious self-mediating process, spirit emptied out into time. But this externalization, this kenosis, is equally an externalization of itself. The negative is the negative of itself. The becoming presents a slow-moving succession of spirits, a gallery of images, each of which endowed with all the riches of spirit, moves thus slowly just because the self has to penetrate and digest this entire wealth of its substance, as its fulfillment consists in perfectly knowing what it is, in knowing its substance. This knowing is its withdrawal into itself, in which it abandons its outer existence and gives its existential shape over to recollection. Thus absorbed in itself, it has sunk into the night of its self-consciousness, but in that night it vanished. Its vanished outer existence is preserved, and this transformed existence, the former one, but now reborn of the spirit's knowledge, is the new existence, a new world and a new shape of spirit. In the immediacy of this new existence, the spirit has to start afresh to bring itself to maturity, as if, for it, all that preceded were lost, and it had learned nothing from the experience of the earlier spirits. But recollection, the inwardizing or that experience, has preserved it and is the innermost being, is the inner being, and in fact the higher form of the substance. So, although the spirit starts afresh, and apparently from its own resources, to bring itself to maturity, it is nonetheless on a higher level that it starts. The realm of spirits, which is formed in this way, in the outer world, constitutes a succession in time, in which one spirit relieved another of its charge, and each took over the empire of the world from its predecessor. The word kenosis, incidentally, does not appear in Hegel's text. The translator inserted it, perhaps with the thought of Jesus emptying himself out, as it says in the letter of Philippians. Although in the King James Version, it doesn't talk about him emptying out. It just says, he made himself of no reputation, whatever that means. And I wish I knew Greek. And took upon him the form of a servant, and was made in the likeness of men. So, the point is, becoming history, becoming spirit, emptied out into time, is an externalization. Spirit emptied and externalized into time. This is an externalization itself, for it is doing the externalizing, and what is externalizing is what it is putting outside of itself. Thus history is brought in by way of implication, implicitly. This is the way of the negative, for which Hegel is well known. The negative is the negative of itself. This is the determined negation, a negation with content. Not a first negation and then a negation of the negation, and hence a minus, and a minus transitioned into a positive, rather a minus transitioned into a plus, or something that is positive, but is not the same as that we started with. This becoming presents a slow-moving succession of spirits, an ordering in time, a gallery of images, and not a reversion to representation or picture thinking, for it is notional thinking in this new world, a recollection of what has been transpiring throughout the history that we have been working our way through in the course of the whole phenomenology, a history of shapes of consciousness, a history of spirits. The self needs to penetrate and digest this entire wealth all over once again, this wealth of its substance to being, to its fully developed state of fulfillment and perfection. Perfection not meaning flawless, but brought to a stage where there's nothing left to add to it, a dynamic, complex living thing that is both in itself and in us. Such fulfillment consists in perfectly knowing what it is in knowing its substance, an abandonment of outer existence and giving existential shape over to recollection. Recall that the creature, the new creature, that should say, in Aldiss's tale, absorbs all the knowledge from the peddler's ship and library before flying the ship back into the galaxy and raising an invasion fleet, then heads for Earth. What is its form? What is its structure? What is its type of consciousness? Self-consciousness thus absorbs into itself, a vanishing outer existence being turned into or replaced by something else. Existence transformed anew. Let me explain the fate which now threatens, the highest said. In the hope you may die knowing a little of what you have done. Our galaxy is old beyond imagining. Philosophers, theologians, and scientists combined to tell us that its duration is vast but not infinite, is nearing an end. The rumour has circulated, you murmured. I am pleased to hear that wisdom travels. We have learned in these last few hours that the galaxy, like an old curtain crumbling under its own weight, is dissolving, that this in fact is the end of all things, of past and future, and of all men. He paused in vain to watch for any shadows of alarm crossing your face, then continued, ignoring the frightened response of your fellow captives. Peace has reigned in the region for millennia, but when we learned your fleet was coming with hostile intent, our ancient ships and engines of attack, unused since the breakdown of the self-perpetuating war, were resurrected systems of production, schemes of battle, organization of fighting men, all had to be resurrected from the long-dead past. It required haste such as we have never known, and a regimentation such as we detest. I come from a new world beyond this galaxy. Now, because the process of creation still goes on, new galaxies are forming out of the fathomless night, rising out of the margins of emptiness. My planet is new, and I am the first man upon it. It is nameless. Welded said, so all you told me back on Aldiss was true. Certainly, you said. You did not bother to tell him how you had learned to pilot the dead shouter's ship. You turned instead to Prim. Do you recall a conversation we once had about evolution? You claimed that man was its ultimate product. Prim nodded. Man is evolution's fittest fruit. In this galaxy, you told him you looked at the highest, at Welded, at One Eye. Without smiling, you said, you are evolution's highest flowering here. Think of the multitudes of experiments nature undertook before evolving you. She started with amino acids, then the amoeba, a simple cell. She was like a child at school then, but all this while she had been learning. I use analogies without subscribing to the pathetic fallacy. Understand, many of her experiments, even late ones like the sentient vagabond cells, are failures. Man, on the whole, is her best so far. In the new galaxy from which I come, she begins with man. I am the earliest, most primitive form of life in my galaxy, the new amoeba. You were not to tell them how in you radical changes had been made. You were in truth a different species. Your waste system was fundamentally altered. Your digestive processes had been changed. Genetically, not only were the old characteristics transferable from one generation to another, walking and language genes ensured that those simple human skills were also inheritable. The psychological basis of your mind had been improved. Much of man's old random emotionalism had been eliminated entirely. Yet you had a range of altruism and identity with things surpassing man's capabilities. Let's just go back a bit to see how we got to where we are. In the Phenomenology, Hegel reveals a possible common ground between religion and philosophy. This is insofar as both in their highest form, which is to say Christianity for religion, and Hegelian speculative philosophy for philosophy, permits us to discover satisfaction in the world and to be at home, according to one interpretation of Hegelianism, though I actually dispute this about Hegelianism being about finding ourselves at home in the world, as some people have expressed it. Excuse me. I don't even know what being at home in the world means. Anyway, while in Christianity the notion of this satisfaction finds expression in the stories and myths of religious representation, in philosophy this notion is given a more literal meaning. Once the apoias, which is a cognitive impasse, apoia, that hinders us from comprehending the world in a rational form are resolved, we attain rational insight or absolute knowing. The form of consciousness that achieves this is absolute spirit. The content of such picture thinking at the level of religion is absolute spirit. Such mere form is to be superseded. That is to say, because this belongs to consciousness as such, its truth must already have yielded itself in the shape of consciousness. So to quote again from the Phenomenology, the spirit of the revealed religion has not yet surmounted its consciousness as such, or what is the same, its actual self-consciousness is not the object of its consciousness. Spirit itself as a whole and the self-differentiated movements within it fall within the sphere of picture thinking and in the form of objectivity. The content of this picture thinking is absolute spirit, and all that now remains to be done is to supersede this here form. There's a misprint there, I'm not quite sure what that says now. Supersede this form, or rather, since this belongs to consciousness as such, its truth must already have yielded itself in the shape of consciousness. This surmounting of the object of consciousness is not to be taken one-sidedly to mean that the object showed itself as returning to the self, but is to be taken more specifically to mean not only that the object as such presented itself to the self as vanishing, but rather that it is the externalization of self-consciousness that posits the thinghood or the object, and that this externalization has not merely a negative but a positive meaning, a meaning which is not only for us or in itself, but for self-consciousness itself. It is rendered evident to consciousness how this absolute knowing is to be attained. It understands that it has failed to find satisfaction in the world, since it has come to the world in the wrong manner, taking on board limited conceptions that must be made more complete. So absolute knowing relates to the notion of complete or unimpaired rational cognition of the world rather than to knowledge of some non-worldly entity or absolute. Consciousness has to learn to bring these limited conceptions together, recapitulating the various stages that the dialectic has already taken in the phenomenology. Starting with consciousness, it is now apparent to us, as phenomenological observers, that the standpoints adopted by consciousness, which was, as you may recall, sense certainty, perception, understanding, were one-sided, and that its truth lies in seeing how no one of them does justice to the way in which individuality, particularity, and universality are related in the object. So, to quote from the Phenomenology, thus the object is in part immediate being, or in general, a thing corresponding to immediate consciousness, in part an othering of itself in relationship, or being for another and being for itself, that is, determinateness corresponding to perception, and in part essence or in the form of a universal corresponding to the understanding. It is, as a totality, a syllogism or the movement of the universal through determination to individuality, as also the reverse movement from individuality through superseded individuality or through determination to the universal. It is therefore in accordance with these three determinations that consciousness must know the object as itself. However, this knowing of which we are speaking is not knowing as pure comprehension of the object, that is, in terms of the notion. Here, this knowing is to be indicated only in its process of coming to be, or in the moments of the aspect of it which belongs to consciousness as such, the moments of the notion proper, or of pure knowing in the form of shapes of consciousness. For this reason, the object does not yet appear in consciousness as such, as the spiritual essentiality we have just affirmed it to be, and the relationship of consciousness to it is not the consideration of it in its totality as such, nor in its pure form as notion, but it is from one side a shape of consciousness as such, and from the other side a number of such shapes, which we bring together, in which the totality of the moments of the object and of the relation of consciousness to it can be indicated only as resolved into its moments. What does the conception of individuality, particularity, and universality as applied to our thinking about objects involve? For an elaborated positive account, we can find elsewhere. I direct you to the Encyclopedia Logic, where he goes into this. For instance, as the substantial might, which is for itself the concept, is what is free, and since each of its moments is the whole, that it is, and is posited as inseparable, unity with it, the concept is totality. Thus, in its identity with itself, it is what it is in and for itself, determinate. The phenomenology is via negative, the way of negation, as I've already explained, focusing upon what is rather than what is not for consciousness, demonstrating how anything less than this complex conception will not succeed, and bringing to light the dialectical limitations that have brought about this lack of success. So it has served, in essence, pedagogical and motivational role, guiding us toward the science of logic, where the positive doctrine will be systematically elaborated in terms of pure categories and thought forms. The various standpoints of self-consciousness, reason and spirit, each on its own, has proven to be incomplete. What is now needed is to discover the way of unifying them into a more complex whole. These are the moments of which the reconciliation of spirit with its own consciousness proper is composed. By themselves they are single and separate, and it is solely their spiritual unity that constitutes the power of this reconciliation. The last of these moments is, however, necessarily this unity itself, and as is evident, it binds them all into itself. The spirit that in its existence is certain of itself has for the element of existence nothing else but this knowledge of itself. When it declares that what it does out of a conviction of duty. The utterance is the validating of its action. Action is the first implicit sundering of the simple unity of the notion, and the return out of this dividedness. The first movement changes round into the second, since this element of recognition posits itself as a simple knowledge of duty, in antithesis to the distinction and dichotomy that lie in action as such, and so constitutes a stubborn actuality confronting action. But in forgiveness is very important in the phenomenology. I must do a video on it. We saw how this obstinacy surrenders and renounces itself. Here, therefore, actuality as well as immediate existence has for self-consciousness no other significance than that of being a pure knowing. Similarly, as determinate existence or as relation, what is self-opposed is a knowing, partly of this purely individual self, partly of knowledge as universal. In this is posited at the same time that the third moment, the universality or essence, counts only as a knowledge for each of the two sides that stand over against each other. And finally, these latter equally resolve the empty antithesis still remaining, and are the knowledge of I equals I, this individual self, which is immediately a pure knowing or universal. The phenomenology placed these single and separate moments alongside one another to demonstrate where each is inadequate when taken on its own. This, what in religion was content or form for presenting an other, is here the self's own act. The notion requires the content to be the self's own act, for this notion, as we see, the knowledge of the self's act within itself as all essentiality and all existence, the knowledge of this subject as substance, and of the substance as the knowledge of its act. Our own act here has been simply to gather together the separate moments, each of which in principle exhibits the life of spirit in its entirety, and also to stick to the notion in the form of the notion, the content of which would already have yielded itself in those moments and in the form of a shape of consciousness. What renders the standpoint of consciousness at the close of the phenomenology distinctive is its preparation to undertake science, which is to say a reflective examination of its categories in an endeavour to overcome the kind of one-sided positions that have just been traversed. For such a science to be possible, consciousness has to come to see through a process of self-examination that it can arrive at a view of the world that will make the world fully intelligible, where until then it has appeared alien to consciousness. Hence, science, by guiding us through the categories corresponding to the limited forms of consciousness portrayed in the phenomenology, can assist us in attaining the sort of dialectical outlook that absolute knowing needs. So, demonstrating how these categories have operated when instantiated in various worldviews, the phenomenology thus constitutes the science of knowing in the sphere of separateness, in the sphere of appearances. Its preparatory role having been completed, we are now prepared to move to the more abstract level of the logic, where these categories can be examined in their own right. I read Aldiss's story. It moves actually from the transition actually takes place to a higher form of abstractedness. Spirit, therefore, having won the notion, displays its existence and movement in this ether of its life and its science. But in this, the moments of its movement no longer exhibit themselves as specific shapes of consciousness, but since consciousness's difference has returned into the self as specific notions and as their organic, self-grounded movement. Or to give the full quotation, Spirit, therefore, having won the notion, displays its existence and movement in this ether of itself and its science. In this, the moments of its movement no longer exhibit themselves as specific shapes of consciousness, but since consciousness's difference has returned into the self as specific notion and as their organic self-grounded movement, whereas in the phenomenology of spirit, each moment is the difference of knowledge and truth, and is the movement in which the difference is cancelled. Science, on the other hand, does not contain the difference and the cancelling of it. On the contrary, since the moment has the form of the notion, it unites the objective form of truth and of the knowing self in an immediate unity. There is a transition within the system from the shapes of consciousness of the phenomenology to the specific notions, the concepts or categories of the science of logic, and hence for science in its pure and abstract form. As Hegel put it, it is the ether of its life. And so here we come to the final part of the closing part of the phenomenology. This revelation is therefore the raising up of its depth, or its extension, the negativity of this withdrawn I, a negativity which is an externalization, or its substance, and this revelation is also the notion's time, in that this externalization is its own self externalized. And just as it is its extension, so it is equally in its depth, in the self. The goal, absolute knowing, or spirit that knows itself as spirit, has for its path the recollection of the spirit, as they are in themselves, and as they accomplish the organization of their realm. Their preservation, regarded from the side of their free existence, appearing in the form of contingency, is history. But regarded from the side of their philosophically comprehended organization, it is the science of knowing in the sphere of appearance. The two together comprehended history. Form alike, the two together, which is comprehended history. The form alike, the inwardizing and the Calvary of absolute spirit, the actuality, truth, and certainty of his throne, without which he would be lifeless and alone. Only from the chalice of this realm of spirits flows forth from him his own infinitude. Which is a quote from Schiller. But these were in the days of before Google, so he was reciting Schiller from memory. Here is the actual, well, when I say actual, obviously he wrote in German. This is one translation of it. We are dead groups of matter when we hate, but when we love we are as gods, unto the gentle fetters yearning, through each state and shade of being multiform, and through all countless spirits, save all of the sire, moves, breathes, and blends the one divine desire. Lo, arm in arm through every upward grade, from the rude mongrel to the starry Greek, who the fine link between the mortal maid and heaven's last seraph, everywhere we seek union and bond, till in one sea sublime of love be merged all measure and all time. Friendless ruled God his solitary sky. He felt the want, and therefore souls were made, the blessed mirrors of his bliss. His eye no equal in his loftiest words surveyed, and from the source when souls are quickened, he called his companion forth, eternity. You said gently, everyone must be told what is happening. That seems imperative. I will not forget. He turned and faced you. What impulse brought you here? Nostalgia? Curiosity? Pity? What feelings do you have for shadows? And what unexpected weakness was it that choked the words in your heart, in your throat? Why did you turn your face away so that he could not see your eyes? I wanted man to be aware of what is happening to him. You said at last that much was owed him. We owed it. You are our father. We are your heirs. He touched you gently, asking in a firm voice, what should be told to the people of the galaxy? You looked out over a city now, pricked with lights, and up to the evening sky. You found no comfort there or in yourself. Tell them again what a galaxy is, you said. Don't soften it. They are brave. Explain to them once more that there are galaxies like grains of sand. Each galaxy a cosmic laboratory for the blind experiments of nature. Explain to them how little individual lives mean compared to the unknown goals of the race. Tell them that the laboratory is closing. A newer one with more modern equipment is opening just down the street. They shall be told, the highest said. His face a shadow, as night fell upon the old city and the stars. We who have already superseded you record these scenes now in your honor, as you once honored man. Requiescat in pace.